Good afternoon. Today we are going to talk about Julie Turkowitz's Happily Gentrifying news article. So it would be beneficial if you had that open. I would expect that everyone would have that open in class to go over it. Hopefully you read the article and identified the trace elements. This lecture is simply going over that and reviewing the article. So when we identify the rhetorical situation, which remember just means the communication of messages, specifically argument or when you're trying to convince someone of something, um, identifying those trace elements, what's the text, who are the readers, who is the author, what are the constraints, and what is the exigence. Those are things that you can do with pretty much looking at the title, the author, the date of publication, and maybe reading the first few sentences, period. Um, reading the first few sentences. So if you, I'm sorry, I just lost my train of thought. Okay. When you identify those elements, you are identifying the context that the article or the speech or whatever you're analyzing was written in. So let's use the Julie Turkowitz article as a model. So if you open it up, first of all, let's take a look at the title and talk generally about the article, and then we'll identify those individual TRACE elements. So the title is Denver Cafe Happily Gentrifying, Neighbors Aren't So Happy. So first of all, you would need to understand what gentrifying means. Gentrifying is the process of businesses more upscale moving into lower income neighborhoods, buying up properties and putting more expensive things in there. And what ends up happening is the people who do live there can't afford living there anymore. For example, landlords buying old buildings and making them into modern housing. That's way more expensive than what the neighborhood used to see. Another example is like a Starbucks buying up corner stores and attracting those customers that can afford the $5 and $6 coffees. So some people think gentrification is a good thing because it brings business to impoverished neighborhoods and brings diversity to different neighborhoods, but mostly the diversity would be bringing white people into neighborhoods of color. So I think a lot of people are on the other side of that idea that it does not bring diversity. In fact, whitewashes these communities of color and pushes people out of their homes, in some cases, quite literally pushing them out of their homes. So this article is about a coffee shop that put a sign outside saying happily gentrifying since 2014. And obviously that caused a lot of issues. Sorry, I'm going to move into another room. I can hear my children bickering upstairs. Here we go. This should be more peaceful where I'm not losing my train of thought. Okay, so this, oh, do you like my fall decorations? Got a little pumpkin there, little wreath. This fireplace will probably be going soon. All right, now back to the article. Sorry, this lecture is a little all over the place. Okay, so we're talking about a Denver coffee shop that put a sign out happily gentrifying. So basically we can assume that this coffee shop is offering those Starbucks priced lattes. You could probably imagine homemade juices, words on the menu like artisanal, organic, gluten-free, those types of things that drive up prices. So when we look at the title, we see the location, Denver, Colorado. And we see that the happily gentrifying is obviously criticized when we read neighbors aren't so happy. So let's take a look at the trace elements. So the text, what kind of text is it? Well, it's an article published in the New York Times, and it's important to know the date, November 27th, 2017. And yeah, it's just an informational journalism article in the New York Times. Probably a good thing to know that the New York Times is a more left-leaning publication, even though journalists are supposed to give unbiased, objective information. I'm going to show you, even in this article, how that is not a reality. Okay, so the text is the article published in the New York Times. The readers, when we think of readers, a lot of times my freshmen will say, oh, it's everybody or it's all Americans. That's fine to start out identifying the targeted audience as such, but we want to think about how is this message crafted according to who the author thought would read the work. So we can assume based on this location that the readers would be folks who live in Denver, Colorado, readers of the New York Times, people in this community, people who patronize this coffee shop. So those are ideas for who are our readers. The A stands for author. We see that the author is Julie Turkowitz, and you don't just want to identify an author, you want to find out who they are. So a lot of times on a published website, you can click on the author's name and it opens up to their resume or biography, or if they have a personal website. So Julie Turkowitz, if you click on her name, she's now a journalist based in South America, but if you read more about her, she used to cover the American Midwest, which is why she was covering Denver, Colorado. That was her assigned journalistic location. She also writes on human rights issues and kind of covers stories in impoverished neighborhoods. So that's important to know about the author. For the constraints, you want to ask yourself, what would limit the author from communicating their message? What boundaries does the author have to stay within when writing the article? What limits might be on the audience? So one limit that comes to mind for me is if the readers don't know or don't understand what gentrifying is, that's obviously going to be a constraint. Because understanding that whole concept is a foundational piece of knowledge, a common knowledge that someone needs to know in order to understand this article. Another constraint is that Julie Turkowitz obviously is employed by the New York Times, so she is constrained to their particular political affiliations. Another thing to look at is the date as a constraint. We know that the coffee shop had this sign up fairly recently in the context of the date of 2017. So that's important because journalists are often tasked with covering news and putting it out there for the public as soon as it's happening, because things are changing. And it was important. It was a constraint for this particular article because protests started happening, and the need for news coverage was essential to get this issue out in the public. If you scroll down in the article, you can see a picture of protesters in front of the coffee shop. So it was a really important local moment that needed to be published. And why is this particular event published in the New York Times, which has a wider readership, obviously, than a local Denver, Colorado newspaper? That's a good question to ask. And I don't have the exact answer to that, but I can tell you that gentrification is an issue in our country, in major cities, and especially in Denver, Colorado. If you look at some statistics mentioned in the news article about how people are being driven from their homes with price gouging. All right, the exigence we kind of just talked about. Exigence, remember, is the motivation or the cause for the argument. So, what made Julie Turkowitz write this article is basically what exigence is asking you to identify. And I would say the protests and the sign, happily gentrifying, it might not even necessarily be the sign itself. If there were no protests or no government officials involved, if you read through the article, it talks about some government officials commenting and, um, saying that this was inappropriate to put in front of the coffee shop. Um, you'll see that there's obviously a motivation and a cause within the idea of protest versus just having the sign out in front of the shop. Um, the other thing to keep in mind is that the journalist obviously interviewed several people, probably even more than what's in the article. And in order to do that, there has to be some sort of issue. So people were taking issue with the sign, and she went to the protest and found some people to interview. Okay. Now, when you're identifying those TRACE elements, your view should be objective. And when I say objective, I mean not your personal opinion about the topic. So when we identify rhetorical situation and when we analyze rhetoric, we want to make sure that we are looking at things like diction or word choice, things like facts and statistics, things like how the author presented the information. We're not, I'm not asking you for your opinion about gentrification. I'm not asking you for your opinion about the protests. I'm asking you to analyze the rhetorical situation. And that can be a struggle for my freshman writers. So that's definitely something to keep in mind that when you're identifying those elements, you have to be objective in presenting that information. The reason is because that makes you a more credible authority on the article, right? If you just start talking about your personal opinion about the topic, that's a completely different conversation than if you're talking about why Julie Turkowitz wrote this article. Why did the New York Times publish this article? Why are there protests according to this article? So you're always bringing it back to the context of the article. And in order to do that, you have to first identify the context, which is those TRACE elements. You are going to have to identify the trace elements of other readings. Specifically, you'll have some practice next week. So if you're confused by anything in this lecture, please contact me. If you were able to identify those things and maybe you had a different answer, that's totally acceptable as well. One thing that I love about my chosen profession and subject is that basically you are right. Your answer is right if you can support it. So some people might have had a different idea for constraints. As long as you can support why you're saying that's a constraint, then you're fine. Some people might have identified a different motivation. Maybe some of you found out that Julie Turkowitz lives in that specific neighborhood, which I don't know if she does or not, but that would be a really important thing to say and contributing to identifying the rhetorical situation. So please keep that in mind in this class that a lot of times my students will be like, "Oh, is this right? Is my answer right? Are these elements right?" That's not really what I'm looking for. I'm looking for you to use your brain and use the content from this course to apply, your own view of critical analysis to these pieces. And that might be different depending on each individual student. Now, that's not to say there are not wrong answers, right? Like you can be wrong with your analysis if you don't support it, if it involves your personal opinion and things like that. So I want to encourage you to be thoughtful and critical. I also want to encourage you to be able to explain your answers. That's pretty much the most important part of this course. So if you're able to do that, then you'll be successful.